I certainly say, Madam Speaker, and I think Oregonians will agree with me.
Political bodies exist to secure responsible government and to execute the will of the...
Okay, we're gonna start this off, episode 2. We're just gonna start off with how frustrating it is being a legislator, passing a law, and the recognition that that doesn't actually translate directly to action. That in between passing the law and something happening is an agency that's going to decide how to create rules around the delivery of that law. I don't know about you, but that was not something I thought of when I first got into the legislature. I didn't think, oh, at some point I'm going to pass a law and it's not going to have direct impact. There's going to be a third-party intermediary that's going to decide what I meant by what we said.
I think a lot of Oregonians don't realize that they're governed not just by the state in the sense of our 3 separate but equal branches, but there is this whole existence called the administrative state, agencies, which are arms of the executive branch, which make rules. And those rules can assess penalties, they can take away people's licenses, rights to work, and there's a lot of them.
Restrict trade, raise a tremendous amount of new fees, taxes.
Yeah. And I would say for this one in particular, that is new information for Oregonians, I think, for most. But the thing has been more shocking to me are the agencies that don't have a law in front of them. A statute wasn't specifically passed, and they look out into the deep blue sky of Oregon and they say, I've got an idea. We need more rules. And they affirmatively go out and pursue additional rules. And I would say, hopefully we'll get to that part of the conversation where there's an executive order from the governor. And agencies say, this is within our scope. We can enact that. Let's go ahead and create our own climate protection program, despite the fact that the legislature didn't pass anything affirmatively on this issue. And all of a sudden, they are it's rule after rule after rule, and it's changing the scope of what they do. And as legislators, how much say do we have in that? I would say not nearly enough. Are we co-equal in that case?
Well, we are under the Constitution. I've read it. We're co-equal branches.
Yeah. Do you feel that way?
Not at all.
It was one of the questions media reached out to me this week because there was an agency accountability question. And they reached out to the committee chair, the subject matter area that they thought that should be the oversight arm of the legislature to consider whether or not that agency should be held accountable for their failures. And the chair of that committee said, well, I don't have time. I don't have time. Which begs the question, okay, well then who is going to hold that group accountable? This was in the Department of Corrections, and we're supposed to have 19 doctors on staff. We've only got 9, the other people on paid administrative leave. So we're paying people to not even be at work, and we're delivering half the services that we should be delivering to 12,000 adults in custody currently. So it's a real question of, well, wait a second, what are we going to do about this? And
and an agency just said, well, I don't have time. I was in the Senate Judiciary Committee this week, and we were talking with the parole and supervision, and they have a backlog of registration of sexual offenders and figuring out how dangerous they are. And so they classify them a 3, which is the most, and 2, 1. And there's this huge backlog, and the legislature passed a law. The governor signed it, tasking them with doing something. And they basically said, well, we didn't have enough money, so we didn't prioritize it. And of course, it was a busy committee and not a time to ask questions, but that begs the question, you can't ignore the law.
Right.
Yeah.
You can't ignore, and yet agencies a lot will just ignore what the legislative branch tells them to do.
In the case of the bills that are in front of that committee, And I know that those bills were proposed by the executive branch saying, listen, we haven't done it. Turns out we don't want to do it. So let's pass a law now to just say that we don't have to anymore. So they are well after the fact. I think that initial law got passed in 2013, and they have not been chipping away at it. We have the highest per capita numbers on folks that have committed sexual assault across the entire nation. Our backlog is extraordinary. I mean, 2,000 people have been identified as level 3 and are posted for the public to see. So, we're talking 34,000-ish, I think is the number all in. And it's an amazing backlog. And so the community is less safe. The legislature said, do this. And the agency now is saying, go ahead and give us a pass. And let's never speak of this again.
Yeah.
It's just terrible administration. It's terrible leadership.
Well, in fact, that was exactly my question of like, if you as a leader of an agency don't do the law, you don't obey the law, you don't follow what the legislature said, and your excuse is, well, you didn't give me enough money. Well, maybe we need to find someone who's willing to take that job on and prioritize according to the legislative branch mandate.
Here.
Yeah.
Yes. Wouldn't that be great?
So here we are, episode 2. We recorded our first episode. I want to remind people who we are. Senator Mike McLane, Senate District 30, roughly the size of Indiana out there, the entire east side of the state of Oregon.
43% of the landmass of Oregon is Senate District 30. 43%.
Roughly 140,000 people living in 43% of the state.
Same as you.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Leader in the House Republican caucus.
Colleague in that way.
State Representative Christine Drazan. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Good to be back.
Yeah, and so I don't know if people know this, but every Senate district is 2 House districts nested in one Senate district. So Christine is in my Senate district, half of my Senate district, and fun that we get to both be leaders of our caucuses and represent the same people.
Yeah, it's been terrific.
Yeah, it's fun. Daniel Bonham, I serve Senate District 26, which is basically put a pin in Mount Hood in that region. And so we came back today having talked a little bit about budget, scope, size in our first episode, and we said we want to talk about the administrative state. We want to talk about administrative rulemaking, what that means, how that takes place. I think Christine mentioned something that we will come back to, because I had that question when we first said we were going to talk about this, is how many were the result of law and how many were the result of an executive order, which will lead us to very fascinating discussion. But first, I also wanted to welcome Ty Visner. He is staff in the House Republican side. He serving which district, remind me?
Rep. Edwards, so District 31.
House District 31,
Rep.
which
Darcy
is
Edwards,
out the
Go
Columbia
Team
River.
House.
Yeah. Woo!
The Columbia River heading towards the coast.
Yeah, we got a little bit of Washington County, a little bit of Multnomah County, but mostly Columbia County. Yeah.
Awesome. And so, Ty, you've done some research for us.
Oh, yeah.
You're going to tee us up on kind of a state of where law and rule making come together and a consideration of size and scope.
Sure, a state of the administrative state, if you will. Okay, so I was curious when I started this. I was like, how many rules do we have? Because I think, as we've discussed, and you have both said, that most people don't realize that they're being governed, not just by these laws, but by these rules that are written by
entrenched bureaucrats.
Yes, I was going to say Joe Schmo.
Unelected.
Unelected, yeah, exactly.
Bureaucrats.
Yes.
Yeah. So, So
Depends on how I feel.
Yeah. There's a certain tone in the word bureaucrat, but anyone who's enjoyed the tyranny of an agency coming down on them definitely would call them bureaucrats.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's what they are at the end of the day. But yeah, so what I went into that going, okay, I want to figure out how many rules there are, and the answer I came to was that there are over 40,000 rules in the state of Oregon.
40,000.
40,000. Yeah, not 4,000. 40,000, which roughly equates to around 42,000 pages, which is a lot of pages. I mean, it's hard to conceptualize.
How many pages?
42,000. So it's 40,000 rules and 42,000 pages. So we're a little bit, there's more pages than actual rules.
How does that compare to law?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head.
Well, there's 38,000 roughly statutes. So we've reached that point in the history of Oregon where there are more agency rules than there are statutes passed by the legislative branch.
Let's eliminate some boards and commissions that are creating those rules.
Well,
What do you think?
that I think we're going to probably dive in and have an opportunity to talk about just doing that. I had to laugh that, I wonder when the day was. Maybe we could find out sometime. When did Oregon have the dubious distinction of having the administrative bureaucratic state pass the legislature in the sheer number of rules? And I don't know when that date was, but we may have to pass a resolution having a moment of silence across our state.
Yeah, it was a dark day.
It was a dark day.
Yeah, it was a dark day in Oregon.
So we're governed by the administrative state more than the legislature at this point.
Yeah.
And they're full-time and ongoing, and we pop in and out,
Yeah,
and I think they do take advantage of that.
We are part-time legislators.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're full-time kind of unelected legislators in a way. I mean, they're able to, with all this rulemaking that they're able to do. I mean, up here on our screen, Health Authority, OHA, 5,000 rules. And
Wow.
that makes me think, like, does anybody know every rule? Does anybody actually have a grasp of all 5,000 rules?
Yeah. I think there's probably people whose sole job it is to know what those rules are. If you're in a hospital or something like that, you got to know it, but keeping up on it. And didn't you say, Daniel, last podcast that there were 500
Just last year.
just
alone.
last year?
Yeah.
500 rules.
What's interesting too is how many times these rules end up being test ground for legislation. So
Which
hot
is
topic,
backwards.
big bill last 2023 session, House Bill 2002, talking about gender affirming care and abortion and different things like that. The origin of that bill was a rule that forced insurance companies to pay for that service, which insurance companies were not abiding by. And so they had to pass a law to give the rule the full force of law. And so every time we would kind of end up in an impasse, Senator Lieber and some others that were engaged with me in the discussions over that law, they kept saying, all we're doing is codifying into statute what's already in rule. And my question was, well, then why do you have to do that? Like, if that's all we're doing and it's no big deal, clearly there's a motivation to do that. Clearly the force of law is a trigger.
They maybe wanted some teeth. I wasn't there.
I wasn't there.
Yeah. And so there must have been some need for enforcement. But one thing we do know is agencies have enforcement authority.
Yeah.
They have the ability to level fines, to write citations, to revoke licenses. And, you can ask the question, well, maybe there are some bad actors, of course. But we all know stories of people who were not bad actors.
Yeah.
And suddenly have administrative rules that they had no idea were even passed. And they're saying, well, I'll come back into compliance. That, to me, it's not an issue that we don't want people making sure that there is an equal playing field in commerce, or that someone's not polluting. It's not that. It's the sheer volume that is what's alarming.
Well, and it's also bass backwards, isn't it? I mean, the agency said, we think that this is the right political direction we should go as a state, and it wasn't quite working out the way they wanted. So they come back to the legislature, and the executive branch asserts that they want to see this codified. And the legislature says, okay. And so we're talking about full control of our state in so many levels with one perspective and one approach. And we've talked about this before. But just this idea that it's very hand in glove really does prevent us from really asserting our equalness.
So Ty, you've got laid out which agencies are the worst offenders.
Yeah, I was
guess.
about to say that. The worst offenders. And I mean, it gets kind of
Wow.
specific. I mean, the Board of Geologists, Examiners, 62 rules. The Board of Dentistry has over 100 rules. I mean, it gets really specific. And yeah, I mean, each of these, State Board of Towing, Oregon Film and Video Office, 34 rules.
How many rules have been promulgated by the state board? What's it called? The State Board of Towing?
Yeah, the State Board of
That's a
Towing.
new board. That's a brand new board.
33.
33 rules.
Brand spanking new.
Is it really?
Yeah. I mean, they asked for a board recently.
So I must admit, I did not know there was a State Board of Towing.
Because it's kind of new.
Okay. And I bet many of the listeners and our fellow
Yeah.
Oregonians don't know there's a State Board of Towing already with 33 rules. It would be interesting to track how many rules will there be in towing.
How many laws do we have
Right.
relative to towing?
Yeah, great
Yeah.
question.
Compare.
Great question.
I'm kind of surprised Land Use Board of Appeals is only 27. Does that surprise you guys?
I'm curious how that would correlate to pages.
Yeah.
I have a feeling that that's
Fair.
disproportionate.
That must,
Fair.
for the Land Use Board of Appeals, clearly, that's probably the rules just governing their particular process.
Yeah.
But because we know LCDC, why don't
Yeah.
you tell us how many regulations are there in Department of Land Conservation and Development?
Let's see. I don't know off the top of my head, but I
Let's
assume
find 'em.
it is.
I got it.
There
I
it is,
think a
right there.
future
536.
There we go.
Right
There we
there.
go.
536. Okay.
That's the money.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where's the environmental? Where's the EQC?
Oh,
Let's do a little search.
is that right there?
Well, it would be under probably.
DEQ.
It would be under
Under
DEQ.
DEQ,
Yeah.
Yeah, 2000. Except that one was interesting because you go, okay, 2000 rules.
Yeah.
That one was 8,000 pages long. And so it literally, the first time I tried to open it on my, I was doing all this research, I was going, okay, I'm trying to figure all this out on my computer. I open it and it crashes my computer. And I was thinking, a good rule of thumb for an agency is if I literally cannot open this file on my computer without it crashing my computer.
That was your state computer
Yeah,
at
exactly.
the Capitol.
Well, maybe
Crashed.
Wow.
maybe too many rules. Maybe too many pages we got going there.
What I love about that is I wonder if Oregonians feel that same way. Like these rules are just crushing their lives. It's crashing your computer. It's crushing their hopes and dreams.
So I think about, so over 2,000 pages. No. 2,000 rules in DEQ
Yeah, these
Yeah.
are rules.
and 8,000 pages.
Yeah.
So when you think about a ream of paper, that's 16 reams of paper
Yeah.
stacked on top of each other.
Yikes.
That's what Oregonians know needs to be. Now,
Wow.
many are legitimate.
And see, that's one of the things. You go through, and some of them are like, "Oh, this is totally reasonable.
Yeah.
This makes
Yeah,
sense."
yeah.
But it's the sheer volume, and it's what gets slipped in, and we'll get to that later with some that I found that slipped in that are a little ridiculous. As you can imagine, there are definitely some that are a little odd. But yeah, no, I did that math, the reams
Yeah.
of paper, and I found that all of the rules, if you were to get all those pages and try to bench press it, it'd be 420 pounds. And so I think another good rule of thumb is if the average person cannot bench press your state's rules, it's probably too many rules.
You can't carry it.
You can't carry it?
You shouldn't
400
have to live under it.
Just pages, adding pieces of paper up. It's 400 and how many pounds?
420 pounds.
420 pounds.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not a bad
Is that your
rule of
new-
thumb.
is that your new next
I'm going to
goal?
call that
You're gonna goal that?
the it's like the tie rule. What is the, where they have, computer power doubles every so many years, that the what's it called?
Exponential.
Well, it's exponential, but there's this rule of, anyway. But the rule of tie is if you can't, if a normal person can't bench press the paperweight of administrative rules, you have too many administrative rules.
It's time to cut.
Yeah, it's time to cut back a little bit, I think. Yeah, yeah. I mean, like this is one, I mean, we have, like I can pull this over right here. This is 13 pages right here. Let's get this over here. Yeah, it's the Oregon Raspberry and Blackberry Commission.
No,
So if
Department of Agriculture.
Yeah, if you're very curious about, they've got rules and they've got 13 pages of rules, and God knows what those 13 pages.
So it's Raspberry and Blackberry Commission as under the Department of
Ag.
Agriculture promulgated rules. Okay, well,
Yeah.
I guess it doesn't apply to me if I'm a blueberry guy or strawberry.
Well, they have
guy.
a blueberry one and a strawberry one, so
All right.
yeah, they've
All
got
right.
a specific one in there. You got 20 pages or something you got to figure out. But yeah, no, I mean, it just kind of goes to show. I mean, there's a lot out there gets really specific.
I've been stuck on the LUBA. I've been sitting here thinking about the rules. There was 20 some odd rules from LUBA. And I think, okay, but when do the rules apply and when do they don't apply? This was probably a whole nother podcast, but I think about the Portland Water Bureau right now was putting forward a $2 billion water treatment plant in East Multnomah County, and they could have put a $300 million point of source up at Bull Run that was a UV treatment and could have saved taxpayers a ton of money. Also wouldn't have to till under type 2 soil that was in production at the time. And so the local residents put forward a land use board of appeals, and I drove up there in the middle of that appeal, and the dump trucks and the earth movers were still going. Like, it didn't stop a local jurisdiction, but could you imagine a private landowner in the middle of a LUBA appeal just saying, you know what, I'm gonna keep going.
Yeah.
I'm sure this is gonna come out my way.
Yeah.
How did it come out?
It's well, they're trying to force legislation through right now.
Oh, you're kidding.
To kind of post hoc affirm that they're okay. The LUBA appeal did send it back.
Remanded it.
Yes, thank you.
And
130-page document. I think I had to come to your office and say, help me read this.
So, so you're right. It did. It remanded it. Now I remember. I didn't read the entire opinion, but so now the Portland legislators want to pass a law that exempts their water bureau from following the law. I guess you just change it later.
Yeah. So I want to come full circle back to the first comment that you made that really, really did spark my interest. So a couple of days ago, I went to AI. I was trying to figure out, okay, I don't have time to go over to the archives and figure out how many rules might have been put forward due to executive order.
Okay.
But one very specific one really hit close to home with me because a rule was put forward due to the governor's executive order during COVID on the heat dome. And so we had the heat rules for our agriculture workers. And that then, in the midst of that discussion, proponents came forward to DLCD and said, hey, when you're considering this, will you also consider the housing rules?
Yep. That's right.
And the director said, we can't conflate these two things. We're so close to solving this heat problem. We don't want to talk about housing yet, but I promise you we'll do that next. So again, the origin, the genesis of this was a executive order saying we've got to solve COVID problems. We're out in public and we've got to do distancing. And that led to this heat rule that led to then proponents saying, hey, we want you to look at this next. Not from people actually living in housing saying, hey, I got a housing problem. Not from any real source data that would say this is a compelling problem, but just people that are advocating saying, hey, we want to talk about housing next. We'll look at it. And it's led to rules. And I'd love for you to jump in here because it's a member in your caucus that got the legislative council opinion, which is our attorneys in the legislature. And they said what?
They said this is outside your scope. You cannot promulgate these rules.
So the legal counsel for the legislature told a legislator that agency was out of bounds.
Out of bounds. Yep.
And-
OSHA is not housing, turns out.
And what did OSHA come back and say?
They said, "You're not the boss of me." They really did.
Yeah.
They said, "We're going to go to our attorneys, and our attorneys are going to validate the legality of this rule, the appropriateness of this rule." So they just determined that they know better than our attorneys in the legislature that guide our recommendations.
One of the biggest challenges, we've been supplying in my community, specifically out in Hood River and the Dalles, where we've had a lot of farm workers that come and live during the harvest season, and it has led to year-round housing. Now, Hood River, a market that right now the average home that I think is on the market today, listed, not the average home price, but what's listed today, I think you're at $989,000.
Wow.
So
Yeah, that's
Not
that's another pod.
not an affordable place to live to begin with. And yet we have people that are living in farm housing that are content with their farm housing. It's adequate housing. We took the Senate president up and a group of legislators and actually were invited into a home, and a husband and wife and daughter said, this is where we live and this is what's what. And these rules now, which are more oppressive than what we require of college dorms,
Yep.
what we require for a wildland firefighter, temporary
You mean that
housing.
OSHA promulgated?
Yeah, the
Yeah,
new
these-
housing requirements.
OSHA promulgating rules.
Yep.
And all right. Well,
And again, because advocates said so, not because tenants came and said, hey, this is a real problem with the housing that I'm in and I need an upgrade. I'm in substandard housing. That didn't happen. Just people that advocate on behalf of special interest period said, I think you should look into this. And so they looked into it, and basically they said, well, federal rules this, state rules this, and we're compromising at this other standard because what they really wanted was over here. And that had to do with square footage. It had to do with the amount of electrical receptacle, like a ton of different things were considered in these rules, how close you could have vegetation to where you lived. So if you wanted to have a community nursery out front where people are pulling from garden, thank you. I was thinking of plants. Garden's the right word.
garden's the right word.
Community garden.
Tomatoes.
Yeah, they wanted to grow tomatoes right outside. They wanted to have flowers right outside, rose bushes, tulips, whatever. And there were rules about that, and all those things considered. The onus put back on these farmers, on average, is about $1 million upgrade per farm. So if you think about it, this was just 20 farmers were hey, you produce housing, or you have housing that's already been produced. What would these upgrades require of you? And on the low end, someone said $130,000. On the high end, someone's $6.4 million. But you think about there being over 400 people that are in farming that have housing that's already been produced. That at the time you produced it, it met the standard and the requirement. And we're saying, but we're going to impose upon you this new standard. And I don't have any motivation behind this that I can attribute to an agency wanting to do this, except for, in my own mind, coming to the conclusion that we just don't want to farm in Oregon.
I feel that way. We're looking at so many issues in the legislature right now that are a full attack on farming. Like it's driving the cost of our vegetables and fruit at the grocery store. Certainly drives eggs, certainly drives the price of beef in its own way. And we've got issues across the board they don't want producers to continue to produce in the state. And at the same time, they complain about corporate farming, the things that they do. Who else could afford this? You're not going to have the hobby farmer, obviously, isn't going to have workers, right? He's out there, but that person isn't production.
Right.
You're going to have the family farm can't afford this. So you're going to end up being corporate farms. If we have farming at all, they will be farms that are owned by investment companies or vertically integrated. Like this is not a good look for the future of farming in the state of Oregon.
So we need housing too.
For sure.
But we're going to eliminate some housing
For sure.
in the name of having the right housing.
Well,
Yeah.
and as you said, to raise the cost like
Yeah.
$1 million on farms. And, when you think about the Hood River area and the orchards, and it just baffles the mind to think, has anyone stepped back and thought about it? But here's the point. Under our Constitution, we elect legislators, we elect a governor, we elect people who are accountable to people. Who's OSHA accountable, right? And so then to have OSHA say to the legislative branch, who says, hey, you're out of bounds, for them to say to a constitutional branch, we don't think so. So we're going to go get our own opinion, and we'll let you know what we decide we'll do. That is administrative arrogance. If the legislative branch says you're out of bounds, one, you would think an agency would find that very persuasive. But then for the legislative branch to have its own chief legal counsel say, yes, and here's my opinion, you're out of bounds. And to have them say, almost in a cavalier, well, we'll see. We may agree, we may not agree. We'll let you know. And I think that's the kind of arrogance that Oregonians have encountered with the growth of the administrative state in Oregon. The 40-some thousand administrative rules, the 42,000 pages, as you said, 8,000 pages of DEQ.
Just DEQ.
Just DEQ. And, people, who's keeping up on all that? Can an average Oregonian really interpret that? And then, of course, as we heard from the wildfire maps, when people had to file appeals to Oregon Department of Forestry. Why? Because it's an administrative process they have to go through. And we heard from Oregonians all over the state. I certainly heard from them all over the state, but obviously in my district, saying, hey, I can't afford this.
Yeah.
I have to hire a lawyer, et cetera. Now we're able to, and ODF came back and said, hey, you don't need a lawyer just to file the appeal. But you can't, if you're an entity and you're going through a contested case, you're objecting to how an agency is treating you, you have to hire a lawyer. Now, of course, nothing against lawyers. God bless them. I am one. But for an average family farm, that's an entity, an
That's
LLC, et cetera. They got to hire a lawyer to go through the administrative process. And that gets expensive. And these contested cases, in fact, in the student teachers standard and practices board, when they came in and they wanted the authority, they wanted to change the statute and apply against teachers who are in contested cases, the cost of the agency for a contested case. I asked the question in the Judiciary Committee, what's the average cost for just the agency says, well, we have to hire Department of Justice lawyers and it costs. And I said, okay, from your standpoint, how much are you paying per contested case? And they said, well, it's, $30,000 to $50,000. And I can guarantee you a teacher
Can't afford that.
is paying more.
Yeah.
And that farmer's paying more.
Yeah.
And
That's crazy.
we just think about our communities, and that's just one contested case. And that is a contested case arises by an agency taking action and interpreting a rule adversely against an Oregonian. And so that's just one rule, adverse finding. They go to contested case to fight it out. $30,000 to $50,000 projected costs on the Oregonians.
So we should talk about money then.
Yeah.
So like if you go back to that listing of all of your agency rules chart, here's the thing about that I find really interesting. The way that our budget is structured is that a lot of these agencies that are listed, not all, but many of the regulatory agencies that are listed the full cost of the existence of those agencies and their ability to regulate is borne by the regulated entity. So farmers pay the cost to be regulated by DEQ and OSHA and everybody else or whoever comes to their door. And so not only, are they promulgating an awful lot of rules that are going to restrict the ability of these local businesses, farm and otherwise, to exist, they have to pay the cost to do that in the first place. And for some of these entities, they receive, some of this, what we call other funds. So their fees, their license fees, their fines, their whatever they are, but they're not general fund. And I do think that plays into whether or not they respond to legislators. Is we aren't actually their purse strings, and they come before our subcommittees and they ask to increase their fees, and they ask to increase all of these categories so that they can, support their additional costs for contested cases or their DOJ costs for attorneys or whatever they might have for growth in their little licensing boards or their agencies. And all these folks are the ones that have to pay full freight for that. So as legislators, we come to them and we say, knock it off. And they say, you're not the boss of me. And legitimately, their money is coming from these people that are just being crushed by these rules, or it's coming from the feds. 31%, we talked about that, of our budget comes from the feds. So we have this narrow band of these agencies that actually have an incentive to be responsive to elected legislators, because we can actually cut their budgets and have an impact on the scope of their work.
Great segue into the next one I want to talk about, literally. So we passed extended producer responsibility, right? Senate Bill 582 in 2021, where we said we want to make sure that if you're producing something, a good that is going to have an impact on the future environment, TV, milk carton, doesn't matter what it is, whatever you're producing, you've got to have the responsibility to make sure from cradle to grave that unit is taken care of. And so we pass a law. We say we think it's going to cost $100 million to these producers to accommodate our request. It's supposed to take place, to be clear. It's supposed to start July 1 of this year is when this program is supposed to go forward. DEQ went out, put forward rules, put forward request for a proposal. The one that they got from the Circular Action Alliance, I'm looking at it here. This is the 201-page document. And if you take the time to read through it, on page 106, you will find their breakdown of how their program will hit people. And
that's the nitty gritty.
The base case is $226 million. The high case is $292 million. Not exactly what we said when we passed the law to begin with, of what we thought the impact would be. And now it's March. July is right around the corner. DEQ said they're not going to accept this. And there's still no explanation for the obligations to producers, to retailers, to local governments. And yet we've got this law in the books that they're responsible as of July 1st. And so we've just left these people in no man land. What are they supposed to abide by? What's the cost going to be? What are the rules? And again, it's March.
So they rejected what they were told?
So they have said that they most likely will reject this. That's what they've said.
So come back and pretend and make up a new number for us, and we'll accept the number we like?
Going back out to bid, I honest to God, I don't know what they're going to do between now and July 1st to get a plan in place that would actually, without coming back and obviously, in my opinion, they should come back to the legislature and say, hey, we need more time.
Delay.
Yeah, we need to delay for 2 years.
Or reverse it.
And help me understand, this is making those who produce goods, the packaging of it.
I voted no.
It comply with
same.
So it ends up being 2 to 3 times more expensive than they projected. I want to know. I would like to find out who gave each other awards after they passed that as champion of whatever, and we need to revoke that award because it's going to cost. And of course, those costs get, put on consumers.
Yep.
And then the cost goes up. And then we, lo and behold, right? Affordability crisis. And we need, and it just keeps adding up. And that's why, when you think about it, and I hope people appreciate who are, following this podcast, is just the size that Oregon has the dubious distinction now. We have more rules than laws passed by our constitutional branch, the legislature. We've got, 420 some pounds. It just keeps growing. And so people have to appreciate that when we begin to address mission creep of our state government, when we get our house in order, when we begin to prepare for what I believe is a reckoning at the federal level on the budget, that this is the state. This is Oregon in the condition in which we find ourselves. And people have to ask the question, is this what I want? When you, as you mentioned, agencies regulating DOGE, Department of, GAMI, or
Geology.
And mineral.
Minerals.
And mineral.
Yeah.
Yada, yada. But DOGE wants a 300% increase on their fees. Now, and they're funded by industry.
Yep.
And they regulate industry. And now they want to charge industry that regulate 300% more increase in the fees. And,
and they're kind of a train wreck. I mean, it's not like they have a great reputation for service. So.
No. And how many, can you look up, Ty, how many rules has DOGE promulgated?
I will try to find that.
And Department of Geology, Minerals, and Industry, or just hit Control F, GAMI.
Yeah, will do. Give me a second. I gotta pull it up here.
Okay, but I just think about that, and that's just so obscure, right? People, but then suddenly that raises the cost.
Yeah.
And then people think, holy cow, it's so hard to afford to live in Oregon.
224 rules. Yeah.
Rules.
Yeah.
And of course, industry is not just regulated by DOGE. When you look at the people who are paying those fees to get DOGE permits, they're also paying they got DEQ.
Yeah.
They got ODOT.
Sure.
You got to move gravel somewhere, right? So you got to have it ODOT regulated when you move it. You got to,
It's all connected is absolutely true, because in particular, if you look at that one, we had a conversation around transportation and what's been happening with project costs. And we have project costs that, Senator Bonham was referencing a project that was $10 million, and he was so pleased to see it only increased to 16, or maybe it was, And so he felt like, that increase was, remarkably manageable compared to others. But if the cost of aggregate goes up, the cost of your road goes up. It's labor, it's materials, it's all of it. And government is driving it and not taking responsibility for our part. And then you get all the way to the end of the line and they say, wait a minute, we can't afford to fill potholes. And the answer on the other side of the aisle is, well, we should raise taxes on people. So they're starting off and they're saying, we're going to raise, these fees on industry at the beginning. That's going to drive up cost of the product, and in the end the project's going to cost more. And so because we can't afford the project anymore, we're now going to raise taxes on the end user. So this entire life cycle of how we operate our state is a cost driver, and oh, by the way, Oregonians, you pay for every bit of that.
I think the number one thing I get frustrated about in the legislative process is every cost imposition we apply to any sector ends up costing taxpayers money.
Yeah.
It just does. Whether it's in the cost of the good at market, or whether it's a new tax, whatever it is, taxpayers pay.
Every time.
And so if we say we want someone to make a living wage, and we use words like that to suggest that $55 an hour isn't enough for a friend of ours that's in a certain sector, and they need to be making $85 an hour. And if you annualize those numbers and you say, well, wait, we got someone making over $110,000 a year, and we're saying that they need to make 170. Is that really a fair distinction for someone that I can hire on the street to hang the same sheetrock for $25? Making up numbers, not meaning to pick on any given industry, but we do that, right? We say, okay, this sector's got to make more, and we're going to drive this cost. And if you invest this amount of state dollars, you've got to spend this money. And so everything gets more expensive. We layer on a cat tax on top of that. To your comment about just some of these things are obviously just driven by the market. Come back to our farming friends. They don't get to absorb this $1 million per house cost and say, okay, well, now cherries cost a little bit more. The global market for cherries dictates how much they're going to get paid for cherries. So every year they're gambling on the fact that the market's going to allow for their cost to be absorbed. Yeah. But really, every time we do this to a corporation, every time we do this to a business entity, every time we do this to state government, all we're doing is forcing taxpayers to have a more expensive life.
Yep.
And I think the frustrating, or at least sobering, realization is the sheer volume of administrative rules. And of course, we're supposing folks know what they mean. And we're supposing that an average Oregonian knows that, hey, I have this agency that is asking me to comply with these rules. I speculate that the average Oregonian has very little understanding of what rules they're not in compliance with. And then they find out they had no idea. You hope that the agency shows some empathy with that. And but then you have to ask the question. We're asking people to follow enormous amount of rules. Granted, a lot of these entities that are being regulated, they hire staff to make sure they're in compliance. But I'm talking about, the sheer number of Oregonians that every day get up and they go to work. Maybe they're in a salon or a barber shop, or and they're in business trying to bring a service to their community, pay their bills, and we find more and more regulation being promulgated by this administrative state. And to ask Oregonians to keep up on the volume of rules coming out, as you mentioned, 500 just in the last year alone, as well as not just keep up on them, but, be in compliance. And to be in compliance, you got to know what they're describing. You got to know what they're about. Most folks don't even know how to have meaningful input into their creation, and then go through an incredible expense if they find themselves disagreeing with the agency's interpretation of their own rules.
So we have in front of the Rules Committee a conversation about rules that happened recently in the House. And it's because, the folks that have to engage on behalf of their industry members in this rulemaking process are just being buried. So even the professionals that are paid to track this stuff, they're being buried by the number of rules, the 500 rules in the last year. But what they also testified to in front of our committee was that all of these entities have a different process for how the public engages in the adoption of these rules. It's not uniform. The notice requirements aren't uniform. Access to the proposed rule and the timing of that and every bit of this process is not uniform across government. And so if you are impacted by multiple agencies, which most businesses are, your ability as a private citizen is incredibly limited to be able to engage on things that might impact your business long term, when the professionals in the industry associations that might represent you are also saying, we can't engage this way. And so they're asking for the equivalent of a dashboard that lists out, here's the agency, here's the rules under consideration, here's the scope, here's the timing, here's when there's public comment for this rule. That would be new. It doesn't exist today. And at the same time, what I discovered when they came before our committee, now, 40,000 rules have been promulgated in the state of Oregon. And I don't recall being notified when these rules were coming up for consideration. There's been a few, probably in the COVID era, when legislators were extremely engaged in some of the minutia of how they were navigating those new mandates. But broadly speaking, I haven't been, as a legislator, as an elected, been notified of a lot of rules that are being promulgated. What they told us in the committee was they notify the presiding officers. So as far as communicating with the legislative branch for accountability, they notify the presiding officers and they notify the bill's chief sponsor. And so in the minority, we obviously don't get the vast majority of the bills passed that are ours. And if we are on, we might not be the chief sponsor. So even to follow up on the bills that are the legislation that is passed that we might have an interest in, let's say that we think that this provider responsibility legislation was really bad and we want to follow along with rulemaking, we need to do what a member of the public does and subscribe to notices from that particular agency because they are not going to affirmatively communicate with the minority party on legislation that we opposed. So even if we think a bad bill was passed, okay, trust me, it could get worse through rulemaking. And our ability to engage in the rulemaking process on top of all the other things as legislators we're engaging in as part-time electeds in this role, we have to go chase down what the agencies are doing on these rules. So the dashboard concept, like potential for extraordinary improvement for transparency, doesn't change the mindset, doesn't change accountability, doesn't create particular limitations on how fast, and how appropriate. But at least you'd be able to see it would be consistent across agencies. It's not a slam dunk. I don't know if they'll do it. I don't know what excuse they'll make if they don't do it. But at least it was brought forward by industry and also a bipartisan group of legislators saying we need a better baseline to address this stuff. I consider that positive.
No, it's a great idea. I think one of the interesting things, of course, is to your point about when do we get notified? You normally get notified post hoc.
Right.
Here's what we did.
Yeah.
We just want you to know what we did. So walking into my office after we had our last podcast, and I said, hey, I think the next one we're going to do on rulemaking. I said, is there any rulemaking process that's been put forward recently that would be particularly offensive? And I was in the office with Justin Breck, my ledger director, and Janine Stice, who follows healthcare and education, some other things. And Janine just reached on top of her desk and said, I got one right here. Like this just came through. Fresh off the presses, it is a 22 to 27% increase in fee-for-service payments for traditional health workers, worker providers program, and organizations in urban and rural areas. And when you get into this, it tells you it's for the equal distribution or redistribution of resources and power, and recognizing, reconciling, and rectifying historic and contemporary injustices. So what does this mean? Who's going to get this money? And you got to read through these things. These are fascinating reads. And you find that this is someone that can demonstrate the ability to serve a minoritized cultural community. Minoritized was a new word for me. Comprehensive knowledge of diverse lived experiences held by the minoritized cultural community being served, including but not limited to their experience of structural and individual racism, minoritization, or discrimination that may have an impact on the community's collective health and well-being. But it's fascinating. So we've found a way now to quantify lived experience as a skill. And if you can demonstrate the skill of lived experience, not necessarily anything that you would normally put on a resume, but if you can now, you're looking at a pay increase for the service that you provide of 22 to 27%. I just fascinated by that.
You were fascinated? Were you fascinated?
Well, disgusted was probably a better word. Yeah. But again, I was like, who came up with this? Where did this come? This wasn't.
This has to be special interest driven, doesn't it?
Yeah, that was not produced by legislative action.
No, unlikely.
Right?
Not that I recall.
And yet it's going to change a budgetary line item that we're ultimately going to have to consider. Where do we make cuts? How are we going to live within our means? Because the state of Oregon does have a balanced budget requirement. We talked about that last podcast. And so how are we going to pay for this?
Well, and it will be a trade-off. Budgets express priorities, right? So we're not going to do something else to do that.
Correct.
Yeah.
Ty, you...
Well, I mean, that's ridiculous. I don't know. That's just my take on it. I feel like what's what's the point of having legislators if this giant
Going right to the heart of it.
behemoth is kind of really in charge? I mean, if they can essentially say this goes, and you go, well, are you sure you're able to do that? And they're like, well, yes, we are. When it doesn't really matter, we're going to do it anyways. I feel like, I mean, we're reversing hundreds of years of human progress towards becoming more and more democratic, more accountable to the average person. I feel like I'm living in medieval England, and there's a decree coming from on high from a few counselors that are around the king, and then it's just like, okay, we got to follow this, and there's no way for us to question it. And I think that's, to me, what really gets me upset about it. Is it feels so undemocratic.
I got the eye on the clock.
Yes. Thank you for
McLane
that.
trusted me to host the second episode, and I said, okay, well, I got to make sure that we're on time.
Thank you for that.
And so I got one more sheet of paper in front of you.
I think in fact, what we might do is maybe
He's trying to get you off the clock right now.
do that. We can do that next episode because I think we've got agency word salad.
Yeah.
Do we have
this
is
is a
that
game.
game ready to go?
This game is ready to go. And, you know,
Explain the rules.
so the rules. Okay. So here's how it works.
How is Bonham going to win?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's going to be three. I've got three.
3 rules.
3 rules that I have found that in my research, reading through these 420 pounds of paper. One of them is fake. One of them I wrote myself.
All right.
2 of them are real. And
2 real, 1
don't
fake.
shout it out. We'll go down the line
All right.
so we can see here.
So it's like the game Two Truths,
2 truths and a lie. It's
Okay.
agency words, and they're a little off the wall. So
Do we have a jingle for this yet?
No, we'll find one.
Agency word salad.
Yeah, no, we're gonna come up with a good
we
one.
gotta have one. Yeah. Okay. So here we go. So number 1, and I gotta put on poker face for all these.
Okay.
Don't look at my face. I'm
We
not
won't
gonna
even look at
change.
you.
I'm not gonna
Okay.
change.
All right.
These are 3 rules in no particular order. Number 1, in certain state parks, leash requirements for dogs shall be determined based on the animal's gender. That's number 1. Number 2.
That sounds legit.
Number 2, in relation to horse racing, the parade to the starting line shall last no more than 12 minutes. If you go
Again,
13
that
minutes, they're putting the agency cops are coming for you. They're going to put the cuffs on and those. Yeah, okay. 3, a game mammal taxidermy mount acquired from an Oregon resident 65 years or older may be sold provided the seller obtains a registration permit. So we got state parks, horse racing, and taxidermy. Do we want to
I've
go?
got mine. I've got mine. I'm ready to lock mine in.
I'm ready. Me
Yeah,
too.
we locking
ready.
them in?
Me too.
Okay, so
I definitely think it's the dogs is the fake one. I don't think that's real. I don't think we care about the gender of the dog on the leash. I think we care about the timing of the horse race, and I think we do want to allow people over the age of 65 to participate in the taxidermy market.
I'm going to admit that I wholeheartedly agree with the good senator. Sorry to
How
be
do you
boring
feel?
about
How do you
that.
feel about that?
I mean,
Does
I,
that disappoint you?
I'm sorry, but it means you can't win alone. I'm sorry. You're going to have to share the
Tie.
prize. It's going to be a tie.
Is it-
Sorry.
We're assuming we're right.
He's going to go
You know, I
contrarian.
I think you're both right on that, and I start thinking, register to sell a moose head.
Yeah. How would they know to register, Mike?
I'd say I agree with them because I just thought some agency, I mean, we cannot. It just boggles my mind if we dictate the size or the length of a leash based upon the gender of a dog. But I'm also, the other 2, I'm also just going, geez, I can't believe they're in
because the horse racing, it's 12 minutes, and then it's got to be 12 minutes. This parade, 12 minutes or less.
And you're thinking, why? How did this happen?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know which one's fake.
All right, so I'd say I'm going to join you 2. I think the first one is the fake one.
The dog.
Okay, are we ready?
Yeah, we're ready.
Drum roll. Yeah.
You all win.
Yay.
It's the dogs. It's the you know, there's no gender.
There's no
requirement.
gender.
No gender
We don't
leash.
discriminate when it comes to leashes and dogs and gender, but
I'm pleased to hear that.
we do have very specific horse racing rules. I mean, down to what colors people are wearing, what the horses are wearing, down to the post parade, how long it has to be. I mean, it gets really specific. And the taxidermy rules, holy moly! And underneath the taxidermy rules, there's a rule about buying and selling feathers. So there's more
help
and
me
more.
understand.
I think next time we have to do it this way.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh,
All right.
okay, yeah,
Food
yeah.
for thought, future.
Yeah.
You know,
All right.
hey, we're
Not
still
bad.
early in this.
Yeah.
So if you're under 65, you don't have to be registered.
You're not allowed to sell,
To
are
be
you?
completely honest, I don't understand it, and I'll read it out. I mean, it's six. If I will read it out like the actual, because I made it less complicated because it was so complicated, and I was struggling to understand it. Okay, so taxidermy. I mean, it was. Yeah. Okay. Let's go. It was.
Obscure and convoluted,
You know
I think,
what?
are the words
I
he's
just-
trying to
exactly.
find
There
right
you
now.
go.
All right.
can't
Well,
find
I
it.
liked plain agency word salad. Sometime we're going to have to figure out, it's the phrase that you just read, right? Of a proposed rule, which, I'm not sure anybody other than
How do you prove it?
yeah. And then
Yeah.
minoritized, I'm assuming that's race, right? Because I'm a part of the political minority.
And
I'm
yeah.
sure they're not going to give me a raise.
I've never
And
heard that.
voters have minoritized you.
Yes.
You would have preferred to have
I would
been
have.
majoritized.
I would prefer to be in the majority, but no, I'm sure it's talking about racial, and
Again, I can keep going.
no.
But it's interesting. Like, it's interesting because, again, I don't
It's
know
pay
that I know what it
raises, right?
means. A practice of supporting and affirming cultural and language practices for the community being served, such as, but not limited to, health and safety beliefs. Health and safety beliefs. Or practices.
What does that mean?
Positive cultural identity, pride or resilience, immigration dynamics, or sacred beliefs. A demonstrated ability to support and affirm clients experiencing intersectional oppression in the provision of service. Like, how do you quantify this? How does someone come in and tick that box and say, I'm delivering this, I could increase my pay?
So they get an increase of pay if they can prove they're doing those things.
It's
to
fee for
benefit that
service.
group. Yeah.
That's legal?
So tell me again what agency this is. This has got to be Oregon Health Authority.
Yep, OHA.
Winner, chicken dinner, that came before our Ways and Means Committee today and asked for a budget realignment
Yeah.
over $600 million.
Yeah, for the Medicaid budget. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a drop in the bucket of the 5,000 that they already have.
Yeah.
Rules.
This was filed February 12th, 2025 at 3:30 p.m.
Fresh off the presses.
And again, what's fascinating to me, and I'm not trying to be silly about this, but I walked into the office and I said, "Hey, Justin, Janine, do you have anything that fits this?" And she said, "I got it right here." It literally was that fast. It wasn't even 30 seconds of let me think about this. It was literally, we were just talking about this. This is the one on the top. So if it was that easy to find an offensive bill that is, well, not bill, sorry, rule, that I can't make heads or tail of exactly what this means. Does that mean that there's a law coming to us in the future? Someone's going to say, hey, we need to have House Bill 3000, whatever, to define this better because we tried to put it into rule and nobody knew what we were talking about. So you've got to pass a law now. I don't know that either.
Okay, so for this one, how does the public engage on this, and what's it posted for? Just to kind of give people a flavor of what this looks like when it's posted.
Notice of proposed rulemaking. I don't have the answer to that. The filing caption, last day
To your point.
submit comment. So you got until March 21st.
Okay,
You got to contact the
somebody.
individual here. Yeah.
So Oregonians who they may agree or not agree, but if they just have no idea what it means,
Yeah.
I mean, even that would be
Useful comment, maybe?
useful comment. I mean, it's
But
kind of a
Martha-
word salad.
Yeah.
Martha Martinez Camacho, rules coordinator. It's got her phone number. It's got her
All right.
email address. I don't know how we want to engage with that if we want that to be on the podcast. So we'll hold off for now. But we probably will let people know that this is happening and ask people to engage.
Yeah. If you like it, great. If you don't, great. But just know it's happening.
Yeah.
And if you're not sure what it means, that's a great comment.
And I'm guessing this is going to be one of about 500 that come at you this year.
Maybe more.
Well, thank you. I mean, we're still getting a feel for this. I think you're going to see as we move forward, people change seats and different people coming to the podcast to present and to discuss. But super appreciate you taking the time, Senator McLane and Leader Drazan and Mr. Visner. Appreciate your participation.
Ty.
And,
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.